Okay, we also have Sternberg. Sternberg said that there's 3 different types of intelligence. Oh, good grief. Come on. Okay. Oh, gosh. Analytic, practical, creative. Don't go crazy. Thank you. Okay. What is analytic intelligence? Analyzing. Very good.
Oh, what the? What? Come on.
Okay, this is not me. This is a stupid computer. Stop doing this. Thank you. So logical, figuring things out, trying to understand why computers get possessed by Satan, things like that. Okay? When you can fix the computer, that's practical intelligence. You can do things. You can fix a pipe. You can build a table. Anybody good with woodworking in here? Do you guys have woodworking at this high school?
Yeah. No, we just have metalworking.
You've got metalworking?
I think we have metal shop. Oh, no, we do have wood. Yeah, we have wood. So I don't know.
Musicians don't like that stuff.
I mean,
Musicians. Okay, where would musicians fall?
creative.
Creative for sure. Okay, musicians. If you're a good musician, you're high in creative intelligence. Okay, you're also going to be a bit higher in analytic intelligence. You'll need more of that because you're going to be analyzing music. Now, you may not have as much analytic intelligence as an engineer, for instance. Okay, and engineers generally are lower in creative intelligence, although they might have a bit of that too. But they're going to have more practical intelligence. So Sternberg said we have all 3, but in different ratios. Some people are really high with practical, some people are really high with analytical, some people are really high with creative, or you could be any combination of the 3. But you can describe everybody's intelligence somewhere on those 3 levels. All right. So we also talked about Spearman last time, right? What did Charles Spearman have to say about intelligence? Yeah.
That you have a general intelligence and then a certain specific.
Good. Okay, so Spearman said you had the general intelligence. So he said intelligence is sort of like a tree. Okay? So the general intelligence is the tree trunk, and then you have specific branches. These are all the specific factors of intelligence. Now, the thicker this trunk is, the thicker these branches can be. So you might have, Gardner said that there's just separate intelligences. But Spearman said, yeah, they're separate intelligences, but they're all based on this general factor. So if you have a weak general factor or a low general intelligence, then you're not going to be advanced in any of these specific areas. But the bigger your tree trunk is, the bigger the branches can be. So the higher your general intelligence, the higher your specific intelligences can be. So he believes something like the IQ test was a valid way to measure intelligence because it was measuring the G factor of intelligence. You didn't need to measure somebody's ability to paint a picture because that's just an S factor. And that's based on how good your general factor is. Okay, that was his theory. All right, so Spearman, Sternberg, Gardner, emotional intelligence, those are the biggest theories of intelligence. Crystallized and fluid intelligence, you remember that too? Which one's creative intelligence? Fluid, okay? As you get older, which one decreases, fluid or crystallized? Fluid. Good. Unless you continue to use it. So if you're a really creative person, even into old age, then your fluid intelligence will stay up. So let's say you're a painter, and you continue to paint no matter how old you get, your creative intelligence, your fluid intelligence stays high. So it's one of those things where you have to use it or you lose it. All right, brain size and intelligence. Does size matter? It matters how you use it. Okay, so we're talking about brain. I don't know what you were talking about, but we're talking about brain size, okay? And you're right, it does matter how you use it, but size does matter when it comes to brain size, to some degree, okay? So the answer is yes and no. So here's a few things to think about. Men's brains are larger than women's. Does that mean men are smarter than women? Okay. White people's brains are larger than black people's brains. Does that mean that white people are smarter than blacks? No. It's not what the research says. Blue whales' brains are, I don't know how many times bigger than human brains. Are blue whales smarter than humans? You know, there's some argument to be made about that, but blue whales haven't gone to the moon yet, right? So I think we can still say humans are smarter. We may not use our intelligence for the best purposes all the time, but we're definitely smarter. What was that?
Flat earthers.
The flat earthers. Yeah, it's so weird that that's making a comeback. Like, people not learn about, you know, the world is round in school. It's so weird.
What's it called?
Yeah, no, but there's an actual, I know there's a cult, but there's an actual science movement that says they believe that the earth is flat. Google it. I'm telling you, there are people out there who truly believe it.
I think there are people who believe Stanley Kubrick faked humanity.
Also, I read a statistic that 25% of Americans believe chocolate milk comes from a brown cow. So. I've had a brown cow. I can tell you. It's not, I wish it did. I've got red cows now, so I should get strawberry milk.
Did you say she has almond cow?
Okay. So brain size does matter, and it doesn't matter. Okay. So we know a blue whale is a very smart creature, but it is not smarter than human beings. So when it comes to the difference between male and female brains or black and white brains, those size differences don't correlate with differences in intelligence. However, we have found that certain parts of the brain are bigger in people with intelligence. Okay? So it depends more on the size of the crucial area of the brain. So if you look at a musician's brain, the area that controls music is going to be much more developed than somebody who's not a musician. If you look at a mathematician's brain, the math part of your brain is going to be more developed. Also, we find that it's not so much the dimensions of the brain as much as the weight of the brain. So a heavier brain is a more intelligent brain than a lighter brain. Can anybody guess why?
More knowledge.
Because the heavier the brain, the more knowledge it obviously stores.
So the heavier the brain, the more knowledge it stores. How does the brain store knowledge? Connections, okay? It makes more neural connections. So you may only have this much space, but the question is, do you have, you know, this many connections, or do you have, you know, this many connections all over the place? So the more connections you have, the smarter you are. So it may not get bigger this way, but it'll get denser. And so if I killed you, took your brain out, and weighed it, I could determine how smart you are by how heavy your brain is. Unfortunately, that's not something we can test while you're alive. So, okay. We've also found in science that the brain will tend to fill up whatever size cavity it has. So if you have a big head, you'll have a bigger brain. And that it has more, the size of your brain has more to do with your skull size than with your intelligence. So men tend to have a bigger skull size. White people on average have bigger heads than black people. I don't know why, just some weird quirk of our genetics. And so they'll have a bigger brain area-wise. But again, the density all depends on how smart you are, okay, or the weight of the brain. And so people who are stupid will have really light brains because they don't have all those connections. All right, I already mentioned this. Females tend to have smaller brains, equal IQs. Most minorities have smaller brain sizes, but also equal IQ. And again, remember with IQ scores, once you balance for how much money you're making, whether your parents are divorced or not, what strata of society you're in, like whether you live in Beverly Hills or Adelanto, things like that, we see no difference in IQ for the different races and genders. On average. All right, so the correlation between size and intelligence is small. It still exists. It is still there, but it's a very small correlation. And remember, it's more about the different areas of the brain, the size of that, as well as the overall weight of the brain. Why is this a correlation? Why don't we say causation? Why don't we say that brain size is a small cause of intelligence? When we talk about correlation. class before the test. Yeah.
Because it doesn't cause it, but they happen at the same time.
Okay, so it may not be causing it. We can't say for sure it's not. All we know is that they tend to go together. So does brain size cause intelligence, or does intelligence cause brain size? Right? So it's the chicken or the egg. So, oh, blow your mind there, philosophy. So, so we know if you exercise your brain, i.e. learn, it will cause you to have more neuronal connections. And then that will increase the size of the brain. We do also know, though, that some people are just born with a more developed brain in certain areas. Mozart, for instance, wrote his first symphony when he was 5, I believe. So obviously we don't know what his brain looked like, but I'm going to guess it was pretty well developed in the music area the day he was born. Okay. So, but then he was well educated. His father was a professional musician. His grandfather was a professional musician, and so he continued to physically develop his brain as he aged. Okay. All right, so correlation is small, but it does exist. Okay, and remember, correlation is not causation. Just because two things go together does not mean they're causing each other. Peanut butter and jelly are correlated, but they don't cause each other to exist. Do you know other countries don't like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches? Aren't they crazy? You're crazy too. No, just kidding. But they think it's disgusting. Like, they can't believe we eat that together. I don't understand it. All right, so let's talk about genetics. So I mentioned Mozart had musicians in the family, generations of musicians. And we know music is genetic. So if your parents are a musician, you have a pretty good chance of being good in music. Not guaranteed, but a much increased chance. If you have a schizophrenic parent, you have a 30 times higher chance than the general population of getting schizophrenia. Then you have, I think with grandparents, it's like 10% higher chance, or 10 times higher chance, not 10%, 10 times higher. Yeah. So it's higher because there is a genetic component, but it's not, obviously it's not guaranteed. Okay, yes.
Why are there two white girls in the corner?
Two white girls in the corner. Who are the white girls? You guys know?
Isn't that Lindsay Lohan? It's like Lindsay Lohan.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I'm going to have to update this with newer twins. Who's the twins of your generation?
Dylan and Cole Sprout.
You guys are making me feel old because I never even heard of it. Oh, yeah, I never watched that.
And they got really good.
Sister twin. The Olsen, sister, yeah. See, that was on when I was a kid. Yeah, Parent Trap. But they weren't, that was just Lindsay Lohan and both of them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought. The Olsen twins actually went to my church when I was a kid. So. Yeah.
I don't know, it looks like Lindsay Lohan was there. I'm blind.
Well, they do kind of look drugged out now, so I guess you can see the resemblance. Yeah. All right, so anyhow, they're twins. So twins are our #1 way of studying genetics versus environment. Because it's hard to tell if you have two siblings living in the same household, are they similar because they're in the same home or because they have this similar genetics? And of course, twins have identical genetics. So if they have similar things, it very well could be because they have the same genetics. Now, unfortunately, if they're living in the same home, again, we don't know, is it genetic or is it environmental? So the way you study genetics is you have twins. Now, we don't do this on purpose. It just happens, and it's unfortunate, but it happens. Twins are separated at birth and adoption and grow up in separate homes. Okay? There should be a law against that, but there's not. And it's great for research because now we know if they're doing the same thing or interested in the same thing or have the same level of intelligence and they're in two entirely separate environments, it has to be genetic. So twin studies are how we understand whether something is nature or nurture. So what do you think intelligence is? Do you think intelligence is genetic? For instance, let's put this in a really cruel way. If you were adopting a child and you knew their parents were dumb, would you be concerned about whether you were adopting a dumb kid?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Anybody say no?
No.
Yes.
Why do you say no?
I mean, I feel like intelligence could be like taught.
Okay, so intelligence is environmental, is what you're saying.
Oh,
Wow, this is
It is a loaded question, that's why I asked it.
well, if you're talking about like education-wise, I think if you're better off, you could get them to study how and all that other stuff.
So-
that they can learn.
If he is a dumb child, can you educate him into being smart? And how smart can you educate him to be?
It's a possibility, but it's not for sure.
See, this is what we've been curious about. How can you take somebody who is dumb and turn them into a genius? Or is it genetic?
I was gonna say a more harsh situation would be like instead of them being dumb, them being like autistic.
It has nothing to do with smarts.
You know, there's a lot of arguing about autism, about whether it is a form of mental retardation or not. And so right now we actually have two categories, autism with retardation and autism without. But like for instance, there was a girl, an autistic girl recently who, I mean, she totally looked mentally retarded. She couldn't communicate. She was, you know, flailing all over the place like severely autistic people do. And she, one day she typed help on a computer. Have you seen that? It went around Facebook for a while. And then she went and she threw up behind the couch. She was sick, so she typed help. And they were like, was this a coincidence? Like, and so they would refuse to do anything for her unless she typed the word, like if she wanted a cookie, type cookie and we'll give it to you. And now she's writing a book about autism, and she's very intelligent, and you would never know from, yeah. So, did you say wait? Okay. So just let that percolate in. Yeah, but yeah, it's amazing. So she appears totally mentally retarded, but she's extremely intelligent. She just can't get it out. She can't communicate. So, but in a normal situation, you have to ask, and researchers have asked, is it purely genetic? Is it environmental? Is it a combination of the two? Because we know in the early 1900s we had the eugenics movement. We thought it's genetic, because we just discovered, and you know, evolution and DNA and all this stuff was big, and they believed if you're stupid, if your parents are stupid, you're going to be stupid. So we need to stop the next generation from happening. We can't just kill you off altogether like Hitler did. That's what comes out of a purely genetic viewpoint. If it's genetic, we should control people's genetics and make sure we develop good people. If it's environmental, we just need to give them the resources and the correct environment in order for them to develop who they are. So we have done a lot of these studies to try to figure out, is it genetic or is it environmental? Okay, so adoption studies. You take two twins, put them in separate environments, and see how similar they are. So here's some of the research. One study said that the correlation of IQs, or how similar the IQs are, for twins raised apart in different homes is higher, so they have a more similar intelligence, than fraternal twins or non-twin siblings raised in the same home. So is that genetic or is that environmental? Genetic. Okay. So twins, identical twins raised in different homes are more similar in their intelligence than the other siblings raised in the same home. So in this study, they found that genetics has a higher impact than environment. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Another study found that when a child is adopted out, their IQ is more similar to their biological mother than their adopted mother. So genetics or environment? Oh, I heard both. So you adopt a kid out, and their IQ is more similar, is closer to their biological mother than their adopted mother that they're living with. Genetics. Okay? So the genes were stronger in this study. So it depends on what study you're looking at. Some say genetics is slightly more powerful. Some say environment is slightly more powerful. So roughly we average it out and we say it's 50-50. So intelligence is about 50% genetic, 50% environmental. Okay. So like a lot of other things, it's a combination. Did you have your hand up? No? Okay. So there is very strong evidence that intelligence is linked to genetics. It is not the whole story, but it is a big part of it. So if you're adopting a child and you're concerned about their intelligence, you only have about half of the control in how smart that kid gets. Okay, I'll talk about that later. Okay, so another study said environment was 57%, so that's why we roughly say it's 50-50. Some studies say environment is a bit more powerful. Some say genetics is powerful. It also depends on the age. At a certain age, genetics versus environment has a bigger impact. Okay. So roughly 50-50. If I ask you on the exam, you'd say 50% genetics, 50% environment. One of the environmental factors is what we call the microenvironment. So the microenvironment, micro meaning little, you choose your own environment. This is the environment that is just unique to you. So even your twin sibling, anybody in here a twin? You're a twin, really? Okay. So even though, who's older? You or your sister? My brother. Oh, not identical. Okay, so fraternal twins. So even though they're born basically at the same time, how far apart were you? 10 minutes? Okay. So 10 minutes apart, but I guarantee you the fact that her brother is older by 10 minutes has an impact on her life. People ask you that all the time? Yeah.
Like, they'll be like a little older, but I don't know, she's,
I've got two twin girls.
Like, okay, have you ever heard of, like, good twin, bad twin? Like, that exists. Like, for, like, I have...
Are you the bad twin?
No. My little sisters, they're twins, too.
No way.
Yeah.
Wow.
Bad twins. They're, like, you can tell, like... Not saying, like, more of, like, who does, like, a lot of... Yeah.
Okay. So, even as a twin, her environment is going to be different than her brother's. Even though they were, developed in the same womb and they were born at the same time, experiencing all of the same history together, they're still going to have experiences that, she's in this class and her brother's not. So this is a different experience than what her brother's going to have. Okay, so that's what we would call a microenvironment. Each person has an environment that is unique just to them. The older you get, the more active you are in choosing your own environment. So she chose to sign up for this class. She might choose to join a club or go to a certain church or go to a certain university or vote a certain way in politics. Okay? So all of these things are things that she's choosing and are going to impact her uniquely. So with intelligence, we know that your genetics determines so much, your parents determine the environment so much, but then you also choose. You choose whether or not to read a book. You choose whether to join the track team or join the chess team. Okay? So that's all going to affect the development of your intelligence, as well as everything else about you. So we select the environment as we age. You have more and more control over it. And at a certain age, you have to stop blaming your parents for screwing you up. So there's a combination of the environment and the genetics. And this is what we call the reaction range. So you can see, like, this sign is from the 70s. If you can read this sign, you didn't go to Wilson Elementary School. So that kid could be a genius, right? You don't know how smart that kid is. But he's going to appear stupid, especially on an IQ test, because he can't even read. Okay? So that environment is going to determine how smart he is, no matter what his genetics are. So the reaction range says genetically, you have a certain capability of being smart. So your DNA may say you could be an Albert Einstein level genius. Okay? You are physically capable of developing your brain to 164 IQ, okay, which is what Einstein was. However, you go to this elementary school and you don't even learn to read. How smart are you going to be? Okay? And let's say you have crappy parents. You don't have resources. You're poor. Okay? That poor black kid in the 70s is not going to have a lot of resources. So maybe he gets up to 100. He's just average. He's not dumb, but he's not nearly as smart as he could be. He's perfectly average because of his environmental effect. So genetically, he could have been the world's next Einstein. But because of his environment, he wasn't allowed to get to the top of his range. Does that make sense? Okay. Whereas you could have a kid who genetically has inferior genetics, I mean, comparatively speaking, inferior to the first kid, but they grew up in, where's a good area? San Diego, okay? Rancho Bernardo, best school districts in the country. So they went to school in Rancho Bernardo, and they got to the very top of their reaction range. And so they're smarter than the kid that grew up in the poor area. Although the kid that grew up in the poor area has better genetics. Does that make sense? You look confused.
Yeah.
Are you still? Okay. So his DNA said you can get to 120 and no smarter, no matter how hard you try. Your DNA limits you at some point. The limit may be really high, may be really impressive. The limit might be okay. Or the limit could be, you know, you can get up to 64. Well, 60 maybe. You can get up to 60 and that's it. So mental retardation. You know, a kid with Down syndrome. Their genetics have limited them to an IQ of 60, and no matter how hard they try, they're not going to get above what the DNA limits you to. But the environment determines where on this range you end up. So physically, you can get to this limit if you have the proper environment. Does that make sense? Okay. So this kid had a better environment, and they got to the top of their reaction range. This kid had a bad environment, and they're really low on their reaction range. And then, you know, the kid whose DNA limits him to 60, he might be in the same school district as the other kid, but he can only get to the top of his genetic potential. Okay? So if you adopt a kid whose genetics say they've got potential, then yes, you can educate them into being smart. But if you adopt a kid without the genetic potential of a high IQ, there's nothing you can do to get them above where their DNA limits them to. Does that make sense? Okay. So we call that the reaction range. Your genetics is reacting to your environment. Now here's the sad thing. We often look at people, you know, you grew up in, what's a bad city in Southern California? I grew up in Rialto. Rialto is an awesome town. I love growing up in Rialto. That's why you got jumped. That is why I got jumped. But the schools were good. No, I love Rialto. I don't know if Rialto's the same as when I grew up there, but if it was, I'd raise my kids there. And learn some of the grit of reality. And I hear the Bloods and the Crips have joined again. So when I was a kid, they teamed up and then they wore purple, because you know the Bloods are red and the Crips are blue. So together you got purple. Yeah. But I love it. I'm into Eisenhower. Eisenhower was awesome.
Eisenhower High School?
Mm-hmm. Oh. Yep. Greatest football team. My sister went here. We moved up here right after I graduated, and then she finished 2 years here. So she's a scorpion like you guys. I'm an eagle. Thank you very much. Although our eagle was stolen by Fontana High School. Then we stole it back.
Did you guys literally have like a real eagle?
A real bald eagle, and they stole it, which is so, like, that's a felony.
Yeah, I was gonna say, is that illegal?
Yeah. It was in somebody's garage, because I think I was in elementary school and it was stolen.
Someone's garage?
And it was in somebody's garage for like 10 years before they found it and then returned it to the high school.
Wow. Wouldn't the bird be dead?
Oh, yeah, it was a stuffed bald eagle.
Oh,
Yeah,
I thought you were meaning real.
No, sorry.
Yeah!
It was a real bird.
That would be hilarious. Yeah, I just kept this bald eagle in my garage for a decade.
I was like,
Yeah.
hey, when did they come here? Like, oh, I'm really far away.
Anyhow. All right, so group differences with IQ. So we see some differences in IQ. And genetics and environment plays a different role depending on what group we're talking about. So for instance, affluence. We're always talking about money. If we have money, if we have resources, then it'll compensate for things. And that's true. It's absolutely true to some degree. But the interesting thing is that when we're looking at the impact of genetics, genetics plays a much bigger role in affluent environments than it does in poor environments. So if you're looking at a wealthy community, Okay, so you've got these kids with, you know, all their different, one's 164, one's 120, 160, another one's 130, okay? All of them are having the resources to get to the top of their reaction range, which means there's going to be a huge amount of variation, and it's all based on your genetic potential. So if you're rich, you better have a good family line. You better have good DNA, because your genetics determines how smart you're going to be if you have all the resources in the world. Now, if you're in a poor area, the environment has a bigger impact. So you don't have the resources, so it's going to be much similar. So the 164 kid might get to somewhere around 100, the 120 might be like 95, the 60 will still be at 60, because, you know, you can't get higher, and then the 130 might be, you know, 110. So they're all going to be relatively the same because they've been limited by their environment. Is that making sense? Okay, this is a confusing one for a lot of my classes. So if you're poor, your genetics actually are not that important. They're not as important as your environment. If you're rich, you have the resources, so you're going to be limited only by your genetics. Which explains why, historically speaking, rich people are much more concerned about family lineage. Okay? You didn't see peasants in medieval England, you know, tracking their family line. They didn't care about that. But all the nobility, oh yeah, right? Centuries and centuries, sometimes millennia of knowing what your family lineage is. And then be really careful what group you marry into, what family line you marry into. So it makes sense. They didn't know about all of this impact, you know, scientifically speaking, but on some level they did know that breeding matters, what they used to say. All right, you guys hate this chapter, don't you? You guys are tired. Last time I taught on this chapter too, and no other chapter. All right, racial differences. Let's talk about that. Maybe it'll wake you up a little bit. So IQ, black people versus white people. What does the IQ score say on average without control of other factors?
White people are usually dumber than white people, over the average.
So black score lower than white people. Now, if you control for certain factors like income level, that's going to change. It evens it out, right? So it's not the race, it is the life circumstances that are making the differences. Now, there's another way that we know that, oops, did I not have that on there? Yeah, there we go. There's another way that we know that it's environment and not genetics causing this. In World War II, a lot of black men particularly went off to war, Germany and other countries, to fight against the fascists. And evidently those Frauleins in Germany really liked black boys, okay? Because there's a lot of black babies that were born in Germany, half black babies, to German women, okay? German women have always liked strong, studly guys, so I guess that they're just into that. So there's a huge explosion of mixed race babies in Germany. Now Germany, as strange as it is to say that Germany isn't racist, they have never had any problem with black people. Jews, some minor issues there. Black people, fine, totally fine. So somebody got smart and said, let's look at half black babies born in Germany versus half black babies born in America during the same time period, and let's look at their difference in IQ scores. And what they found was these half black babies born in Germany were just as intelligent as all the other German babies, full white babies. Whereas if you compare the half black babies born during World War II to white babies born in World War II, you have a significantly lower IQ score. Okay? So obviously that's more evidence that the environment is impacting the IQ score of minorities, and it's not genetics that are impacting the score. You also see a difference if you look at a black kid born in Mississippi or Alabama versus a black kid born in Southern California. The one in the states known for racism have a lower IQ score, whereas the ones born in California are meeting the typical state average for everybody. Okay? So it's that environmental impact. They've also done studies on black kids who are adopted into white families. And they found that those kids have on average, they have an equal IQ score to the rest of the family that they've been adopted into. Okay, if you average it out. So again, it is not It has nothing to do with race, with any difference in the IQ scores. Okay? It's important research that we did. Okay? Obviously, we're all like, yeah, we know that now. But you go back a few decades, or even today, you go to certain parts of the world, and they're going to, they could use some education in these sciences. All right, so we already talked about all that stuff. Oh, here's one thing I skipped, is test bias, okay? So test bias is also one of the reasons why minorities have scored lower on IQ tests. Because the questions were written by white people, affluent white people. It wasn't like David Weschler was some poor white trailer trash guy, right? He was a highly educated doctor of psychology, and he wrote the IQ test. So it's geared towards more affluent white people. So if you're a poor white, or you're a poor minority, or a minority of any kind, then there's cultural bias in the test. So it's not like, it's asking about Shakespeare, it's not asking about flow rider sort of thing, okay? So, some white kid from New England probably won't be familiar with, a rap singer, whereas, some inner city LA kid would be. So, it isn't how intelligent they were, it was whether or not they were familiar with the subject material at all.